Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you once again to our Krasno Global Events Series. It's great to see you again on our event entitled America's Future, Socialist Awakening or Neoconservative Revival with our two distinguished discussants, John Judis and Bill Kristol. Unfortunately, this is our last event this semester. We'll start up again next semester, probably in late January or early February. Until then, please go to our YouTube channel and watch all our past event videos. As you know, they are really good. And the address to the YouTube channel is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As you know, the Krasno Global Events Series features leading experts with a wide range of expertise, and we always talk about issues of global concern. We have a great website that is krasnoevents.com. And tonight we are dealing with the future of the United States after Trump and what to expect during the incoming Biden administration. Bill Kristol and John Judis will discuss the election outcome, the future of the Republican Party, and whether or not there will be gridlock in Congress. And of course, they will also enlighten us about the likely domestic, economic, and social policies, as well as the foreign relations of the incoming Biden administration. I will introduce our distinguished speakers in a minute. Let me just say that each speaker will talk for approximately 15 minutes. I will then pose a few questions to each of our speakers and try to find out more about their views. And then, as always, we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. As you know, we would like you to submit your questions to our panelists with the help of the chat version, the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants, Alison Carpenter and Brittany Broom, will select the most interesting questions and read them out aloud. Thus, please don't be shy. Please submit your questions. And of course, feel free to ask provocative questions. Can I also ask you to mention your name and perhaps your affiliation or city or country when writing down a question? And please ask short and succinct questions. This would be great. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our Krasno event on America's Future, Socialist Awakening or Neoconservative Revival. Many of you will be familiar with our distinguished speakers today, John Judis and Bill Kristol. John Judis is a socialist writer and journalist, and Bill Kristol is a renowned conservative writer and the founder of the Weekly Standard and now editor-at-large of the Bulwark. What they both have in common is that they voted for Joe Biden and believe that Trump is a danger to the Republic. Perhaps let me first introduce John Judis, and we then listen to John's initial remarks before I will then introduce Bill Kristol to you. John Judis has joined us as a Krasno speaker twice before, in September 2014 and in February 2019. And I'm pleased and delighted that he is with us again today. John is a well-known journalist and author. He has just published yet another book entitled The Socialist Awakening, What's Different Now About the Left. And I've got a copy here, and it is available in all good bookstores and from Amazon, of course. And I've just read it myself, and it's indeed a very good and interesting read. John started his career as a founding editor of the newspaper The Socialist Revolution way back in 1969. And then in the 1970s in Chicago, he became foreign editor of In These Times, a democratic socialist news weekly. In the 1980s and 1990s, he became a senior writer and then contributing editor to the New Republic and the National Review. He is now editor-at-large at Talking Points Memo. And throughout much of his life, John Judis has been busy writing books, such as a biography of the conservative writer William Buckley, and he has written about the paradox of American democracy. He also wrote about the folly of empire and what George Bush could learn from Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. More recently, John has become well known for his popular books on Truman and the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict and The Populist Explosion, how the Great Recession transformed American and European politics. In 2018, he published The Nationalist Revival, Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization. It's great to welcome John Judis again to the Krasno Event Series. Today, John Judis will tell us about his insights about the future of America after Trump. Over to you, John.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in North Carolina, and I wish I was really in there and not sitting in my room here in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I'm happy to be here with Bill Kristol, and I'm a big fan of the Bulwark, which is this thing I get in the mail, in the email every day. We're supposed to debate whether what it's going to be neoconservatism or socialism. I hate to disappoint the listeners. I think the answer is going to be neither to that. I'm also going to go backwards a little and talk about Trump, who I hope will soon be our ex-president. Elected in 2016, partly by a fluke. The Comey letter right at the end of the election, just a deplorable campaign by Hillary Clinton that ignored a large part of America and the states that ended up going for Trump. But I think we have to recognize that Trump did speak to a large part of the country and spoke to that part of the country that really had been ignored by both parties. We have a kind of, to use an old John Edwards slogan, two Americas. He talked about the poor and the rich, and it's not really that. It's an America, on the one hand, post-industrial cities, metro centers, finance, electronics, education, healthcare, fairly prosperous. On the other hand, a lot of the Midwest, a lot of the South, deindustrialized, small town, middle-sized towns, where people are really cast back on their basic verities of life: God, nation, family, having a gun to protect your home, and have a very different outlook from people in these post-industrial cities like where I live in Washington, D.C., who have many identities and who have a much different view of life. Trump played on that to a great extent. Key issues, again, trade deals that had decimated a lot of these areas, including North Carolina and the furniture industry there, gone to Mexico. Immigration, both a culture clash and competition with low-wage workers who are Americans. Political correctness, the idea that there are only certain, you have to say what is that, Latinx or Hispanics? That's the proper way to say it. A whole set of kind of vocabulary and ways of life that had become politically correct. And again, a feeling of a lot of part of America that they were being looked down upon. Trump spoke to that. President, he becomes president. The question for me is this guy going to sand off his rough edges and not be a bomb thrower, not be a divider? He runs his presidency like he runs his campaign. Very ugly, very divisive. Charlottesville. I mean, I don't need to go through all the things. Substantively, can a populist, can somebody who runs against the establishment be the establishment? What are you going to do if, in effect, you've run against what the people in charge are against? And he does do some things. On trade, I think you got to give him credit for improving NAFTA, for raising the issue of U.S.-China trade much more clearly than had been raised before, leaving aside, again, what he really did accomplish there. Also, the area of taxes and the area of healthcare, that's a place where he really had to give in, I think, to the Republicans in Congress and did things that were contrary to what he was promising in his campaign and what a populist would want to do. The Steve Bannon populist, taxes mainly for the wealthy and corporations, healthcare, repeal Obamacare without replacing it. 2018 election. Democrats get a big edge. I think, what, 41 seats or something like that. And a lot of it is just a referendum on Trump, I think. It's a referendum, again, on the healthcare deal and on just the sheer ugliness of him as a president, of his breaking all these kind of norms in terms of lies and what have you that we expect from a president. Still, having suffered that kind of defeat going into 2020, he's the incumbent. I still think he could have been reelected, given the state of the economy and given that we were 3.9% unemployment, best in like 45 years or something like that. So I think he had a lot going for him. But come 2020, you get the pandemic. You get Trump's bungling of the virus, the magnification of all his evils, the evils of his style, the attacks against the fake news, the idea that the virus itself was a hoax, et cetera, et cetera. So at that point, I think he really became vulnerable. And Biden was the perfect candidate to defeat him, because Biden, first of all, could speak to a lot of these areas of the country that both the Republicans and Democrats had neglected, the Michigans, Wisconsins, Ohios, Pennsylvanias. The big advantage. Biden wasn't associated with a lot of the craziness that took place in the summer, which again was a legitimate response to police brutality, but escalated into riots and violence. Again, he was a kind of relic of the old New Deal kind of liberal. He was a different kind of guy. And Trump attacked him for being around Washington for 40 years or something. But that was actually an advantage, given the fact, again, that we were facing this pandemic and something that we had to rely on government to solve. And Trump, in this case, had completely failed to do so. So the election, I think, was a mandate very much on Trump. And Biden represented a kind of neutral body. And so people voted for him rather than voting for Trump. It was a mandate to do something about the virus. Beyond that, Green New Deal, all that kind of stuff, I'm not sure. The congressional election, I think the congressional candidates were hurt to some extent by the defund the police and things like that. What the results finally showed to me, though, was that we are, in our terms of our parties, at a kind of unstable equilibrium. It was a phrase used by the political scientist Walter Dean Burnham, that we're really just going back and forth. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if the Republicans win back the House of Representatives in 2022. Very even. And Trump was, again, I mean, this kind of, I think in terms of his style, not so much his policies, but his style was an aberration that I don't think is going to be repeated. Now, what we face in terms of the future is Republican Senate and a Democratic White House. I think the House is going to have very little say. And the real fight is going to be Senate versus McConnell versus Biden. The imperative at this point is to spend really big. We have not only unemployment, we're going to have to fund the dispensing of virus around the country. Are we going to do it? That's the question. And are we going to fund the government? Are we going to fund all these businesses that have gone out, and especially small businesses, in the face of the recession, so that we have a vibrant economy in 2022? Or are we going to have a situation like we had in 2009, where we get a initial stimulus bill that was like about 2/3 of what we needed, and then the Republicans suddenly become worried about deficits, and we have unemployment, for the next 4 or 5 years, and the Republicans win the House, all that. So, I mean, for me, again, the question there is going to be, does McConnell and the Republicans care more about the country and what we need to do as a country, or about winning in 2022 by undermining Biden. So by 2022, you know, people are unhappy. We still have unemployment, and you know, that's the kind of situation again that will get the party in power losing congressional elections. So that's really the question that I would have facing the future. That just in closing, the one thing I want to say is that Trump was a kind of man in the street perception of things, a kind of common sense. I mean, you know, on something like NATO, the average person, among which I count myself, might wonder, you know, after the Cold War was over, well, what's really the point of this? Now, again, for policymakers in Washington, they had a whole deal of what should happen. But for Trump, it was a real question. And I think that resounded with people. The trade deals, had we gotten screwed over the years? Why had we lost all these factories? Immigration, we let in millions of people unskilled to compete with Americans, again, and African Americans in particular, who only had a high school education. And again, it was a time, 1970s, 80s, 90s, when we didn't have this kind of sanctioned discrimination where a lot of people might have moved up the ladder, but instead we had a real squeeze in terms of those kind of workers. Trump, again, nativist, incendiary, you know, Mexicans are rapists, a vile way of dealing it, but it's a real issue. So I guess the other thing I would ask in terms of the future is, are we going to deal in a sane way with these kind of issues that Trump brought up?
Thanks very much, John. In your book, you outline that you think we are in a situation which is similar to the 1930s when FDR saved the country and certainly the American economy in the long run. Is that really correct? You say we are in a similar period of transformation?
Well, you know, I had hoped, because I was, as a lot of people, deluded by the polls, that we would have a Democratic majorities all around. So there wouldn't be any problem about doing big things. I think we're more in sort of 1930 than 1933. But the similarity is this, that for the last 30 years or so, we had certain kinds of basic assumptions by which we ran our economies, by which we conducted our foreign relations. And all those have suddenly come under fire. Free trade, you know, again, not open borders, but to a great extent. Our foreign relations, Russia, China, enlarging NATO, all these kind of things. So we're at a period where we're really going to have to change the way we're doing things. 1920s, very similar, gold standard, doesn't work anymore. This kind of arrangement created by Versailles afterwards, with Germany paying reparations and so on, doesn't work. They're in a situation, Great Depression hits. What are we going to do? And in that situation, it wasn't automatic which direction we were going to go in. What was automatic, I think, was that government was going to have to play a big role. But was it going to play a big role as it played in, you know, Italy or Germany, or was it going to play a big role as it did in the United States? So I think we are in a situation where over the next 10 years, we are going to see greater government intervention in our economy. But my question is it going to be democratic? Is it going to be on behalf of labor, or is it going to only be on behalf of capital? And I think if you look at, or even organizations like the Business Roundtable, if you look at the Republican conservatives in this group like American Compass, Rubio's recent statements, I think they understand too that we're going to have something like an industrial policy in the country where we're going to, you know, think about what are our vital interests and how do we protect them and how do we sustain them, and do we depend on these supply chains so that we can't get an aspirin because it's made in China or something like that. Those are real questions. I think they're going to come up. And that's the similarity, I would say, with the period from 1920s and 1930s.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm sure we will discuss that more in a little while, but let me first come to Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol has become well known as a frequent commentator on various TV networks and, of course, as the founder of the conservative The Weekly Standard, which was at the time financed by Rupert Murdoch. Already in the 1970s, Bill worked on the Senate campaign of Daniel Moynihan, and he taught US politics at the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard. And in the mid-1980s, he became involved in government. Bill worked as chief of staff for William Bennett, President Reagan's education secretary, and then he became chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle. And at the time, someone referred to Bill Kristol as Dan Quayle's brain. Later, Bill Kristol became associated with a number of Republican projects and think tanks, such as the New Citizenship Project, the Project for the New American Century, the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, Foreign Policy Initiative, the Emergency Committee for Israel, and many, many others. Bill also was a columnist for the New York Times and a TV commentator on ABC's This Week and for Fox News and ABC News. In the early 1990s, Bill Kristol led the conservative opposition to Bill Clinton's healthcare plan, which, as you know, resulted in the defeat of the plan ultimately. And 10 years later, Bill Kristol became a strong proponent and defender of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Commenting on the Bush administration's response to 9/11, Bill Kristol reportedly said that we have just been present at a very unusual moment, the creation of a new American foreign policy. But soon he criticized Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's mistakes in conducting the war in Iraq and came out strongly in support of the surge of 2007 and thus of committing more troops to the war in Iraq. Bill Kristol was a strong supporter of the 2006 Lebanon war and of Obama's intervention in the Libyan civil war of 2011, but he strongly criticized President Obama's policy toward Iran. Bill Kristol was strongly opposed to Trump being nominated as Republican candidate for the presidency in 2016. He criticized Trump's troop withdrawal from Syria and Afghanistan, and he criticized Trump for undermining the rule of law domestically. Bill Kristol has also been very critical of the lack of backbone of many Trump supporters in Congress, and he endorsed Joe Biden for president. In February 2020, he said that as long as Trump was in office, he would regard himself as a Democrat. It is therefore a great pleasure to welcome the Democrat Bill Kristol to the Krasno Events Series tonight. Bill, would you like to give us your insights about the election outcome and the future of American politics, please?
Well, thank you, Klaus. It's good to be with you all. Like John, I wish I were in North Carolina in Chapel Hill or maybe in Durham. Our oldest daughter went to Duke, so I spent 20 years. That was a long time ago now. She showed up there in 2000. So I spent 20 years focusing on UNC and Duke and rooting against UNC. So nothing personal, just loyalty to
We'll forgive you.
Our child there, you know. I very much agree with, and it's great to be with John, who I've debated over the years, and I've always learned something from him. And I think I'd say John's work is an example of you can disagree with what he would like to see happen, but you learn a lot from his actual analysis of history and political science. And so that's a good thing. And I think more people should read people they disagree with, because you can actually learn a lot and maybe not change your mind, but the analysis is often interesting and often done in a way that people on your side, so to speak, aren't interested in some of those same questions, or put aside certain facts to feature other facts. So it's good to be with John. I don't really disagree that now, that since we're both anti-Trump, maybe it's a different world, different moment. I don't really disagree with much analytically that John has said. I do agree with his first point. I think both of us probably we might once have hoped for a socialist awakening, and in his case, or a neoconservative revival in mine, but it is a new era. What did Tocqueville say? A new political science is needed for a world quite new. And I really feel that we are at and people say that a lot, it's a new world, everything's changed. But I really feel this is an unusual moment in that respect, that we had, in retrospect, from 1992 to 2016, the post-Civil War era, fairly coherent kind of 25 years, in foreign policy and in domestic policy for all the drama, and it was considerable at the time. Of course, Clinton impeachment, 9/11, obviously, and the Middle East war is still in the big picture of economic policy, of the way of world politics, I would say, a fairly stable period, 3 8-year presidencies, all 3 presidents reelected, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. I feel that in a way it's typical when you, in American history, when you move from one era to another, for a president, for an incumbent to be defeated. For the 8-year, Americans have the inclination to reelect the incumbent. It usually happens, but when that doesn't happen, it may signify that we're in a new moment. So both Trump's upset victory, which was a little flukish, but still in 2016, and then his defeat as an incumbent, not a massive defeat, but a clear defeat in this year, may suggest that I think we are in sort of new and somewhat uncharted waters. So where are we? Trump lost. For me, that's personally a good thing. I mean, not personally a good thing, but I think a good thing for the country, in my personal judgment. I have a sense of relief about that. But it was a pretty close election. I mean, if you look at the 3 times an incumbent has lost, it would be about 6 million votes for Biden when it's all in, maybe a little more, 4% plus, but still not an overwhelming repudiation. So in that respect, Democrats are pleased and anti-Trump Republicans are pleased to have Trump out, but certainly for Democrats, and in this respect, I'd include myself, not the kind of overwhelming victory they had hoped for. If you think of it, 3, now 4 presidents have lost re-election bids in the last century. Hoover in 32, obviously in the midst of the Great Depression, clobbered by Roosevelt, who won by 17 points, and picked up, I think, 92 seats in the House and had overwhelming majorities of which to govern for the New Deal. Reagan in 80 won by about 9 points, picked up 12 Senate seats, had momentum, was able to get his economic tax plan through Congress, partly with some Democrats who were the forebears of Reagan Democrats in the South in particular, became Reagan Republicans pretty quickly, Phil Gramm and people like that. So that was an election with coattails and momentum. Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush, the White House I worked in 92. And that was actually a closer race, a little under 6 points, no coattails. They actually lost, Democrats lost House seats, kind of a little bit like the victory this time. And while it was an important generational change, it was more the voters were tired of, 12 years of Reagan Bush. The Cold War had ended, time for a younger set of politicians to focus on the post-Cold War issues, education, healthcare, and so forth. Clinton and Gore did a good job of making that case. We certainly didn't do a good job of explaining why they still needed us around after winning the Cold War. I mean, no good deed goes unpunished. Reagan and Bush do a pretty impressive job in foreign policy. And of course, voters decide, not foolishly, that, we don't need to focus on foreign policy. So could we just have a domestic policy president, please? And Clinton comes in and inaugurates this new era. I think we're in a slightly similar situation today in the sense of no big mandate. I mean, think about it. Clinton won, but 2 years later, Republicans won both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years. So not exactly a FDR-like changing of the political system with a new majority party. And in fact, since then, as John suggested, we've had balanced, really evenly balanced political parties. Probably the longest time in American history we've had that phenomenon where the parties each typically lose control of one or both houses of Congress after they win the presidency because everyone wants to balance them. We've had divided government for a huge percentage of these last, 28 years. Samuel Lubell, who was a political scientist from way back when, said that typically in the American system, you have I think he called it a sun party and a moon party, a major party and a minor party. And his big example, that would be the Democrats, FDR through LBJ. And then another party, which can be competitive, which can win the presidency, which can win Congress occasionally, but basically reacts to the major party and sort of moderates it some and maybe picks up versions of its ideas. That has been the model, I think, really for most of American history. It's probably the model for democratic politics most of the time. It seems like systems tend to work that way, kind of. That's not been the case. We've had sort of a bizarre, not bizarre maybe, but an unusual situation, evenly balanced, increasingly bitter, increasingly partisan, increasingly polarized. Not very healthy, I think, maybe for the system, but understandable when you think of the incentives at work for each party. Ron Brownstein, very shrewd political analyst and observer and commentator, talks about trench warfare, and each 2 years or 4 years, the trench between the two parties and their voters, red America and blue America, rural and urban, metro, and sort of what he calls the coalition of transformation. And he's a little biased towards the Democrats on this, but versus the coalition of restoration. The trench gets deeper and wider. Trump got more votes than Romney in red America, and Trump in his second run got more votes than he did in his first run among rural voters, among evangelical voters. And Biden got more votes in metro America than Hillary did in 2016, who in turn got more than Obama did in 2012, 2008. I mean, the degree to which, and incidentally, I would just want to comment on this for people thinking about it in kind of political sciencey way. It's a mistake to think of the states now as red states or blue states. I mean, some of them are obviously more red or more blue or in between purple, but it's really red areas and blue areas, or even red sub areas and blue sub areas. Harris County, Texas, which is Houston or Dallas, those metro areas look in their voting patterns, but also sociologically, culturally, demographically, more like metro areas outside the South, more like Denver, more like even Philadelphia, honestly, in their voting, than they look like other areas in their own states. They could be, which are wildly different in terms of their preferences. I think North Carolina, Charlotte is more like Atlanta, which is more like Denver, which is more like Phoenix, than is like, maybe, rural parts of North Carolina, and the same, obviously, of the Research Triangle. So I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, honestly. It's due to many sociological and demographic changes and patterns. No one planned this way. It's a free country. People can live where they want. Businesses can locate more or less where they want. Universities are where they are, and then they grow and they have their own network effects. And so you have very different, situations. But certainly the divide sociologically and culturally has manifested itself in a pretty big way politically. So that's kind of the situation we're in. Trump won a clear victory. Was defeated, and Biden won a clear victory this time. But it was not a repudiation of Trump and Trumpism. I mean, it looks like Republicans picked up 10 House seats, much to everyone's surprise. The House is going to be closer than people think, and not as easy to govern as people think. It's not like Pelosi can just, the Speaker Pelosi can just snap her fingers, and every Democrat will necessarily vote for everything that she or parts of her conference want. And a lot of these, more than a dozen Democrats come from districts now that Trump carried, for example. And there are regional differences, obviously, on energy policy and climate and so forth, that will make it a little less easy than I think people sitting here in Washington, where John and I are, or in New York or whatever, you just think, well, of course, this is the Democratic agenda. Well, someone should check in and make sure that it's the agenda that 218 Democrats in the House support, not just 180 or so, and make sure in the Senate, even if they were to get to 50 with the Georgia senator, with victory in the Georgia Senate races, the Colorado Colorado Democratic senators and the Arizona Democratic senators, and even the Virginia Democratic senators, where I live, are not exactly the same as Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and others. And for that matter, Chuck Schumer isn't really the same as Elizabeth Warren on financial services and so forth. So there's more diversity beneath the surface of the Democratic Party, I think, in particular. This sort of is the Republican Party, but it's been so submerged by everyone's intimidation by Trump that it's a little hard to know what the Republican Party would actually look like post-Trump. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think that's a big question. But the lack of coattails, the lack of a landslide, the lack of a real mandate, you might say, for Biden, I think he may have been the only Democrat who could win. So there's a lot of gratitude towards him, as there should be among Democrats, and he'll have some leverage for that reason. But he doesn't have an FDR or Reagan-like mandate. In the state houses, the Democrats picked up no state houses. I mean, again, usually when you oust an incumbent president, that's not so easy to do. So it usually means there's a kind of a big wave down ballot, which there was for Reagan and FDR. And there really wasn't this time. Republicans will control redistricting in a lot of states. So it doesn't look like it's, oh my God, a new era, the Republicans are reeling, and what are they going to do? In fact, and this is unfortunate from my point of view, because I would like to see a big Republican rethinking, but their attitude, as far as I can tell, is very much, Trump alienated a few people, kind of unlucky with the pandemic. His style put people off, but we don't have to do that much real rethinking. We have to kind of meld the populist stuff a little bit better with the corporate stuff. But Trump showed how to do that in a way. A lot of populist rhetoric with basically, in my opinion, standard Republican kind of economics and a little bit of, with some China bashing. Not really clear how important that was in policy, but anyway, various people, Hawley, Rubio, Cotton, they're all going to try to work out their own version of this kind of melding, but they're not into fundamental rethinking. Now, events could force them to rethink, of course, but I would say that for me is what's true. They think they're going to win that, is striking. They think they're going to win the House in 2022, which again, from a political science point of view, they probably would, all things being equal. They think they have a good shot at winning the presidency in 2024. If you just get back 1 or 2% of those Republican voters who were just so put off by Trump, they couldn't stand the idea of 4 more years of Trump. Plus Biden's not gonna have an easy time. So who knows what the world will look like by then. They're at a sort of status quo mentality. So it is a kind of funny situation. I mean, as John says, there's unstable equilibrium, I would say, between the parties and within the parties in some sense. What's going to happen? Big question, who knows? I mean, Biden matters, right? I mean, we look back and we sort of speak of the FDR administration as if, well, that had to happen because, it was the 30s and someone was going to do something big. But of course, it could have been a failure. I mean, he could have not been successful in the policies could have failed, or some did certainly, but he rethought those or got saved from those in some cases, perhaps, and then the war came along. But but he held the coalition together. He won a massive re-election victory. Those things were not entirely inevitable. Other countries had different patterns during the 30s, where parties were punished for failing to deal adequately with the Depression. So I think a lot of our future depends on, is Biden successful or not? I mean, a successful presidency has a big effect in America. An unsuccessful one also can have a big effect. And I think it's very much up. I wish him well. I like Biden. I'm probably like some of his policies, maybe more than John would. I don't know, but a little more conventional and less populist and than some other of the Democratic candidates would have been, certainly, but less socialist than Sanders and less hostile to Wall Street and so forth than Warren. But I don't know how successful he'll be, and the world is the world, and it's complicated and things can go wrong. I think he has a good opportunity with the pandemic in the sense that Trump messed it up so much that just common sense management of the public health situation, combined with some economic stimulus, combined hopefully with the vaccines then working and us being able to come out of this in 9 months or so, could get Biden off to a pretty decent start. I do think, just knock on wood, the country will be in better shape a year from now than it is today. And Biden would get some credit for that, as he should, presumably. And that gives him a little bit of a launching pad to do, other things. But I am struck, I was on a thing earlier today on Zoom, of course, panel discussion kind of thing. And there was a very bright, young progressive Democrat. And I was a little, I said something innocuous like what I just said. I think that Biden's obvious place to begin is with the pandemic management, plus getting money to workers and businesses and to states and localities so that people can keep afloat until they get their jobs back and until taxes come back and so forth. And he was quite unhappy about that. Biden's pledge that climate change is one of the greatest problems we face, and he's going to have a massive climate change proposal right at the beginning. And he's not just going to legalize the DACA recipients, which I think he could do easily, and there'd be support for it among Republicans, but he's got to do a massive immigration overhaul. And it's like, I don't know, does he really have support for that? And how much pressure will he get within the party to do that? I think he'll resist that pressure, but it is, again, a party that's not entirely united, to say the least. So I think it's a time of real uncertainty. And you look at the world situation, obviously big questions there. You can't just go back to kind of pre-Trump, presumably, in foreign policy. I myself would like to go back to America as the heart of the liberal world order and much more of a pre-Trump bipartisan consensus, to the degree there was one. But, when you pull out of TPP, you end up with the trade deal that was just announced last week with China and the Asian countries and us not in it, right? So that now Biden's facing a different situation than he would have faced, than Hillary Clinton would have faced, certainly in 2017. So I think a very uncertain moment, a time for fresh thinking. I'll just close by saying that could be an opportunity. I mean, it could be healthy. Maybe the kind of gridlock and trench warfare, to use that metaphor, is run its course. But the system is not friendly to fresh thinking right now, and neither party is particularly friendly, I would say, to fresh thinking right now. So how that emerges, could you cut across the two parties? Could you have a new center of some kind? Could you have interesting ideas from the left and right coming together? You can see, I'd say, germs of that in terms of regulating the tech companies or other issues. But, how does that happen politically? That for me is a very big question going forward.
Thank you very much indeed. That was most interesting. Let me just ask you a couple of questions. Are there not two concerns right now? The one concern is that Trump will try to run again in 2024, that his shadow will really be over American politics, and particularly, of course, the Republican Party, but all of it. And secondly, is Biden really up to it? A lot of people have expressed concern about his age, his health, and his fitness for office, not for a few months or for a year, but for a full year, and perhaps after that as well. How do you see that?
On the second point, who knows? Obviously, people's medical conditions are not predictable, but no, I think Biden is up to it now. I think he had a good campaign. I really do think, and I looked at some data. Ron Brownstein had some data. I'm not convinced that other Democrat wins is able to get as many suburbanites to come over and hold the coalition and get good turnout, not super good turnout, but good turnout from African Americans and so forth. And so, I think he ran a good campaign. I think he has a good team, and I don't think, who knows what happens 3 years from now, but he has a good, competent vice president. So I don't see any great crisis on that side of things. No, look, Trump's overhang or shadow is a huge deal, certainly for someone like me who hopes or would have hoped that the Republican Party could liberate itself. I think it's because it was a reasonably close election, because these Republican members of Congress and candidates who won, they were tied to Trump. They did okay. They don't think it's great. They'd like Trump to retire more quietly and peacefully and go to Mar-a-Lago. They don't really want him tweeting. They don't have to worry. They would like not to worry about waking up each morning about having a little attack from Trump or from his kids. They'd sort of like him and the family to go away and do fine and let them kind of carry it forward. But they also could think they can kind of live with the situation. They can maneuver the way they have for the last 4 years, is the way I would put it. Now, they may be kidding themselves. That is, they may be at a tiger that they can't control, and that if Trump just continues to radicalize everything and delegitimize elections and do incredibly irresponsible things, and the rhetoric just keeps getting more and more heated, and the threats of violence, they may all be, they've been incredibly, from my point of view, irresponsible in failing to confront any of this. But I don't think they think right now that they have to confront it. They think they can sort of manage it. Now, as you say, if Trump actually runs, Trump will certainly say he wants to run to keep himself relevant and all that. And I don't know, this for me is a huge question. I really don't know. And I'll just stop with this, and I'd be curious what John thinks. I mean, I can argue, and I've argued both ways. I've argued, they haven't liberated themselves from Trump or Trumpism. It's pretty deeply embedded. It's got a major news network, and now more than one. It's got social media platforms. I mean, the idea, it's kind of an international phenomenon, that kind of nationalist populism. It's not going away, and Trump will continue to just, hit at it, and therefore he will continue to be he or Trumpism at least will be a major force over the next 4 years. The contrary argument is, well, he looks major now, but 6 months, 12 months from now, you're an ex-president. He's not getting any younger. People get a little tired of it. There's big fights in Congress on foreign policy or domestic policy or this or that. And suddenly, some senator is speaking, leading the charge on this side, and someone else is leading the charge on the other side. And Donald Trump seems a little bit like yesterday's news. America's a very future-oriented society, and maybe they don't pay that much attention to the ex-president. And therefore maybe that's even true of some of his style and some of what he's, the ways in which he's mobilized social media. Maybe we go to something a little more sane, or maybe we have sort of Trumpism without Trump, and we have new demagogues and new dividers of the country, a new incendiary rhetoric. Or maybe we have some attempts at Trumpism with a human face. I mean, you can write a lot of different scenarios for how the Trump thing plays out. We've never really had a president like Trump. We have, for all one can dislike a lot of our presidents in the last century, but we haven't had someone who's really been a full-time 24/7 demagogue who's happy to take divisions in the country and make them worse, and not just occasionally when he sort of feels he has to politically, but just 24/7, and demonize opponents and minorities and the whole thing, and question the patriotism of his critics and undermine the faith in the electoral system and in our democratic system and ignore the rule of law, all of that. We just haven't had a president like that, which means it's hard to know what things look like after a presidency like that.
Thank you. Before I turn to John with the same question, let me also ask you that apparently it was a narrow victory for democracy, that the institutions have held largely, and democracy, or a narrow majority of the Americans were in favor of maintaining the current system, more or less. But it was a close call. How do you explain that a lot of Americans, over 70 million, seem to have not given a damn for democracy, or would not have been opposed to a much more authoritarian style of government, which to the outside world, particularly to Europeans, was a severe shock. We always looked at America as that democratic beacon, and now we find out it was really a very narrow call.
I would say, a lot of those 72 million didn't like the authoritarian aspects of Trump. They just excused them more than I would have, and because they liked other policies or they really disliked and were fearful of the Democrats. The degree to which the Democrats let themselves get painted into a corner on some issues, unfairly, mostly, honestly, to fund the police, socialism, all this stuff, is kind of astonishing. But they did, and people were willing in this media environment we're in with Fox and social media. They kind of believed a lot of that stuff. I'm not excusing them. I'm just saying that. So I don't think it's quite fair to say 72 million people voted for authoritarianism. I think it is fair to say they didn't put as much weight as I would have wanted to on repudiating authoritarianism and demagoguery and various forms of really, nativism and so forth. They didn't put as much weight on that as I would have liked. And so that's a fair point. Look, this is a big issue in social science, right? American exceptionalism, which I think, is a bit before it became a political phrase, was an actual phrase in social science coming from Germany, I think from Zombart or something, and becomes a big issue in America, understanding America. How do we avoid fascism? How do we avoid communism? That was the simple version of American exceptionalism. And people had a million different explanations. We were a big country. We had, there were Tocquevillian explanations, and there were quasi-Marxist explanations, and there were cultural explanations, and all these things. This was big when John and I were in school ages ago. This was like a big issue in political science and in commentary on America. Pretty interesting discussions. I think you could say that we aren't so exceptional. We're having elections that look a lot more like elections that we've all read about, both a century ago, but also recently, obviously, in major European countries and Latin American countries and Asian countries, where there are serious authoritarian or authoritarian-ish threats and parties, and they get a lot of votes. It's not like that hasn't happened elsewhere. And so I'm not happy about that. I think it's something to conjure with, though, and to think about it. And then there are explanations of cultural change was too rapid, economic displacement was too severe, and all those. Obviously, there's some truth in all these different explanations. And Trump was a pretty unusually effective demagogue, and a lucky one too, I would say. If you look at 2015, 2016, how different would our world? So a lot of this is contingent. I always dislike. I think John may agree with me on this. I dislike the kind of excessively deterministic explanations. Trump might not have run. Trump could have run and gotten, Jeb Bush could have been a better alternative candidate, not another Bush. So it looked like a parody of the establishment. Let's have Bush and Clinton again. So there could have been a more effective version of Rubio or something like that, and you could have had a different outcome, and then we would all be having a very different conversation. And then certainly in terms of winning the general election, if Comey doesn't do his thing and he doesn't win. So, it would feel very different than if he had lost, and people would have said, well, that was kind of an interesting experiment, but let's go back to something else, So I don't want to be too deterministic about it, but what happened. And we've now had a president for 4 years. For me, this is a very big deal. He was president for 4 years. It's not Jeremy Corbyn, who was leader of the opposition party for 4 years, but then lost, and has now been repudiated. I think it's fair to say, by the Labour Party, and it's not that hard to repudiate someone who leads the party for a while and loses. Goldwater would be a good instance of that. Now, there were still elements of Goldwaterism that then became important, obviously, but you don't get the same kind of effect as having been president. And that's where I really don't know what the future holds, how deep the Trumpist mode of politics has penetrated not just the Republican Party, but the country.
Thank you. John, what do you think? How deep is Trumpism, both in the Republican Party and in the country?
Well, again, I think that there is this kind of cultural divide, but let me go go the other side of that question. You know, a lot of the left-wing liberal political scientists had this analysis after Trump won that and it's still, you still hear it, that the whole election was about white supremacy and his voters were all racists. Right? You've heard this analysis. My view of that is different, and it just ties in with what we've been discussing, which is to say that you know, most Americans are racist. We have prejudices. We're very complex people. I grew up in Chicago on the north side, and we used to think that the blacks are going to come in the south side and kill us all. I mean, I'm just saying, in our we're brought up in certain ways, so we have these different kinds of ideas. Obama again gets a lot of the voters that end up going to Trump. The thing is that what Trump did is he really brought out the dark side of America. And he brought to the surface a lot of these kinds of prejudicial, bigoted feelings that we might still have, but that people would have given other things a priority. In the Midwest, when there was a really strong labor movement, that focused people very much on economics, on class issues. And even if they were prejudiced, even if, you know, a white guy hated black people, might still vote for the Democrats because it wouldn't matter. A lot of Hispanics, again, anti-abortion, but that doesn't become the guiding thing. What Trump did really was bring the worst side of our nature out. And, you know, to go back to what Bill said, think about what the Democrats did in the primary this time. And again, I'm a Bernie voter, so, you know, I have to say this, but still, I don't think he would have won. And Obama and Clyburn saw the prospect that Bernie was going to be the nominee and that he was going to lose. And they got all these other people out of the race, and Biden won. I mean, there was a certain conspiracy there. Now, in New Hampshire in 2016, very similar thing could have happened. I think Rubio or Kasich would have been viable. But again, the Republicans didn't have the kind of leadership that you know, that Obama or Clyburn, and in that case, you wouldn't have had Trump. And I don't see. I mean, I'm deeply critical of the way the Republicans have behaved under Trump and the way they've given into him. But I don't see another Trump on the horizon. I mean, people talk about Tucker Carlson or somebody like that. I don't, you know, the politicians, the Nikki Haley's, the Cottons, the Josh Hawleys, the Rubios, those are not Trump. They are conventional people, and I think that they would make normal presidents if they're elected. So we might have the policies, we might have a, you know, again, a debate about US-China immigration and stuff, but I don't expect, and maybe I'm just too optimistic that we are going to have that kind of divisive president again in, you know, at least in our lifetime.
Thank you. How do you see the situation in the Democratic Party then? Will the Democratic Socialists in the party now make pretty stern demands on the new President Biden and perhaps divide the Democratic Party, prevent it from maybe governing as effectively as they hopefully do?
No, I don't. I mean, they'll make the demands, but as long as McConnell controls the Senate, it doesn't matter. I mean, you know, the House could vote for have the government ownership of the means of production, it wouldn't matter because it's, it wouldn't even get to the floor. It wouldn't even get it to a Senate committee. So I think, again, a lot of the action is going to be there. And to a great extent, until 2022, 2024, the left of the Democratic Party is going to be marginalized. So,
Okay. If you were appointed as an advisor to Biden, which may well happen, you never know, what would you tell him to do initially regarding domestic and foreign policy issues?
Oh, well, maybe I'll let Bill talk more about the foreign policy, but, the domestic is just obvious. We have a raging virus in the country. We have a lot of people unemployed. People talk about the economy kind of, jerking back, and I think that will really come back strongly, but we're going to have enormous problems with commercial real estate, these big cities, again, that affects banks. I mean, we have it's going to take a long time for us to adjust and to repair the damage to the economy that this pandemic has done. So that would be absolutely the first priority that I would set for Biden.
What about a big infrastructure program, something like that?
Well, that's fine. And, again, if you call it the Green New Deal, you're going to have everybody who's close to gas or oil going crazy. So, but, again, we need to redo our electrical grid. This is a field where I am really at sea, so I can't tell you all the things to do, but absolutely. And, you see it now in Europe. And Boris Johnson just proposed today a major infrastructure plan in Britain. So we have to do it anyway. I mean, we have problems with bridges and roads and the airports and all those obvious things, and that we should do it in a way that's energy efficient.
And why did Trump never do it? Because he would have had the support of the entire Congress, wouldn't he?
No, but that's the whole point. I mean, again, this was the one thing Bill said that I did disagree with. It was hard to find things, but I think that there really is new thinking in the Republican Party. I mean, he couldn't get it from the kind of Tea Party kind of Republicans. I mean, they really are kind of knee-jerk anti-government, especially I'm talking about the Freedom Caucus in the House. Again, the McConnell, the business Republicans in the Senate, they're just not that enthusiastic about it. But again, the Rubio, Hawley, Cotton, that group, industrial policy, we have to do big things. They're even talking about unions as being something that we should have and not try to do away with. So I think there is a new thinking, but it has not existed, and in order to get it, you're going to have to run over some of this kind of knee-jerk anti-government sentiment among Republicans.
Thank you. We have plenty of questions, and I want to turn to them in a minute. But Bill, just let me ask you the question as well. If you were appointed as an advisor to Biden, what would you advise him to do during the first 100 days, both domestically and also foreign policy-wise?
No, I very much agree that the virus and the economy should come first. And I think if you get success there and things are kind of going, you might say naturally, somewhat in his direction, hopefully, then you can do some other things. I think the main thing I'd say in governing, and this may be just fanciful, I don't know. Certainly when I got to Washington and when I was in the White House, we were in the minority. I mean, Bush was president from 89 to 93 and Democrats controlled Congress. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how to pick off particular Democratic members, how to form coalitions. We ended up Bush signed some legislation he didn't love, but that he thought was right. Clean Air Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, did the budget deal of 1990. Maybe he paid a big political price for that, but nonetheless, it was much more normal to sort of for the parties not to be totally in lockstep. We're so used to it now with McConnell, especially in the Senate, but actually with Pelosi in the House too, and before that, the Republicans in the House, that it's hard to imagine you could go back to that. But I sort of wonder, is McConnell quite as powerful as he was without Trump there to backstop him? One reason McConnell was powerful is that Trump delivered a lot of stuff for these senators. I mean, a lot of favors in government, personnel favors in terms of judges, the people they wanted to see on the court, but also just in the routine functioning of government, and not in a corrupt way, even though there was some of that. You know, if you're a senator and your party's in the White House, you have a lot of things you'd like to get done in terms of policy. You'd like to lobby the relevant cabinet secretary. And again, let's just leave aside kind of corruption, for policies that you honestly think would be good for your state. And you'd like to get your phone calls returned by that cabinet secretary, and you'd like to have them take your views seriously. And the same with the White House. And Trump was pretty good, I've got to say, for all that he allegedly didn't know Washington. That kind of thing he understood, you know, the art of the deal. So he was pretty good at using the leverage, which then allowed McConnell to sort of come in behind him and keep the party together. No one wanted to cross Trump and McConnell. If McConnell's just the majority leader, but the Democrats control the presidency and the House, I don't know. Do some of these senators not say, okay, well, let's make a deal on immigration or on infrastructure or on a bunch of issues? Maybe they splinter a little more. You could have the same in the House, incidentally, where Pelosi's majority is narrow. So I would encourage Biden to really try to find majorities on some of the issues he cares about and try to get some Republican support. I just think psychologically, this is something both Bushes understood, actually, and Clinton understood. Even if you don't literally need votes from the other party to pass some things, if you can muscle stuff through, it feels different if it gets 8 or 12 senators from the other party. It's covered differently by the media. It's the tradition in America that the big pieces of legislation do get some bipartisan support, the ones that really stick and that make a huge difference. Of course, they're primarily Medicare is primarily Democratic legislation. We got a lot of Republican votes, and in a way, that's what certified that it was a sort of a big deal. You know, Obamacare finally got entrenched, I suppose, after the pathetic Republican efforts to repeal it. But it was a partisan thing, and it was kind of an albatross for Democrats for quite a while, actually. And now it's still, insofar as it's a positive, it's because the Republicans are so bad and coming up with an alternative. So I would encourage Biden to see if he can't get some Republican support for some of his legislation and domestic policy. And I would say the same in foreign policy. And in foreign policy, it's probably easier because he's a centrist and he doesn't want to withdraw from everywhere, and probably doesn't want to rethink things as much as John would want him to in some places and some things like China. So he could get Republican support on some of these issues, fight with the left wing of his own party a little bit, the more dovish part of his own party. So that's where I think despite the appearance of the parties being mobilized in a World War I type fashion, trench, each mobilization on both sides of the trenches, I kind of wonder whether it doesn't at some point get more interesting and more fluid in terms of and if I were an ambitious young member of Congress at either party, maybe I'd want to make a name for myself and, co-sponsor a bill with someone from the other side, even if leadership doesn't like it, and try to make a run at it. Jack Kemp made himself famous that way in the late 70s. I mean, people forget that used to be the way you became sort of an important member of Congress often, was by taking on your own party leadership and having I worked for Dan Quayle. He wasn't that important a senator when he was picked, but the one thing that no one remembers this, that he was best known for, I only worked for him when he was VP, but before I worked for him, he was a very young senator from Indiana, quite conservative, a Reagan kind of guy, came in on the Reagan coattails in 80. How did he distinguish himself from the pack? He got with Ted Kennedy and sponsored some job training kind of improvements. I don't know what, honestly, I have no memory of whether they made a big difference or not, but it was, it was kind of a thing at the time. And that just doesn't happen anymore. Maybe the partisanship is so entrenched that it can't happen anymore. But if I were advising not so much Biden here, but an intelligent young member of the House or the Senate, I'd say look for something that's a little different than just showing up to cast your, check off your party vote every time you vote.
Thank you. Probably America's most important foreign relationships are those with Europe and with China. What would you advise Biden to do? Just to continue on the same sort of hardline path with China as during the Trump administration, or do something more imaginative?
It's hard to know. I mean, I was always a China hawk. I was actually a skeptic about China's accession to the WTO, to the World Trade Organization. So in that respect, I was with some people on the left. I remember, but a lot of that for me was a democracy and human rights issue and a geostrategic issue, probably more than a trade issue, where I'm a little more of a free trader. I do remember going to a press conference once in 1997 or something with Nancy Pelosi, who was then a not particularly well-known, getting to be well-known, but not in leadership, member of Congress from, obviously from California, who was very strong on human rights in China and political repression there, and dubious, to her credit, of the notion that just because you have a lot of trade and economic progress, that it's going to become a wonderfully liberal place in terms of politics. So, so I'm not sure that I represent, these are cross-cutting cleavages then at this point. Yeah, I think he can easily restore the alliance structures to be healthier in Europe and in Asia, though. I think in Asia we missed it. I do think the canceling of TPP, with Trans-Pacific Partnership, was a big mistake, whatever the economic side of it, which was probably not that important, but as a geopolitical matter. So I think Biden has some pretty low-hanging fruit at the beginning. Everyone in Europe is going to be so thrilled just to have a normal president they can deal with, and who will be somewhat attentive to their concerns, who will rejoin the Paris Accords and climate, who will do some things that they kind of think are be respectful of international organizations. That I think Biden, hopefully, could have a pretty easy first few months. Now you say that, of course, we look at the history of presidents, something always happens, and Europe loved John Kennedy. He was great. It was a new generation and all this. And then, of course, he's in office, I don't know what, 3 months or something, and he has this disastrous summit with Khrushchev, and then we have a bunch of crises and so forth. So, it's not so obvious that Berlin, so it's not so easy to. The world doesn't always cooperate with what administrations want, but that would be my basic advice, I guess.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Let's get some questions in. Brittany, would you like to ask the first question?
Of course. So the first question we have is for both panelists. And the question is from Ed. It says, if COVID had not occurred, do you think that Trump would have won re-election? Why or why not?
John, do you want to start?
Well, I think I already said that. I think he would have had a really good chance of winning, and the main reason is the economy. We had a pretty buoyant economy, and I think that he would have had a much easier time in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, some of those states that he lost. So the answer is. Again, I don't know. Maybe, it would have been close, but I think he would have had a pretty good chance of winning.
The counter argument, and I think that's true, but this couldn't have helped him really, COVID. But the counter argument is, I guess, twofold. On the one hand, the polling actually before COVID, so let's say February 1st, actually had Biden up ahead of Trump by about 4 points or 5 points, which is exactly what the race ended up. So in an insane kind of way, we went through this unbelievably tumultuous year. It really is amazing. We had impeachment, COVID, all kinds of revelations about what Trump had done, and with Bob Woodward's book, and you name it. We had, Trump attacking people, chaos, the first debate. And at the end of the day, I think this is true if you go back and look at the average of the polls on, like January 1st, or maybe even the end of last year before impeachment even got serious, it's kind of where the race ended up. People didn't change their mind a lot about Trump. And we found, I was involved with Republican voters against Trump. We did a lot of focus groups and polling. And what was interesting in the focus groups, and this was a little shocking to me, actually, people did not blame Trump for the mismanagement of the virus, of the pandemic, to the degree that I certainly do, and that I think would be fair to, frankly, but they just thought they did, if they were at all inclined to be for Trump anyway. So obviously 45% of the country was just, hates Trump and was happy to blame him for everything, and, be appalled by things he would say and failure to be responsible. But a lot of the country loves Trump, so that's a different story. But the in-between voters were sort of, look, it was hard. These things, it's kind of crazy. No one was expected this. He did shut down the China stuff early, but then he made some other mistakes. But there's a lot of sympathy for the reopening, a lot of sympathy for, he kind of gets it that, we've lost our job here. We have a restaurant that we built up for 32 years, or I work at a restaurant for someone who built it up over 32 years, coffee shop in middle America, and it's closed. And yeah, it's bad, the virus. And I don't want to give it to my grandparents, and I don't want to, take risks. But we can't just shut everything down. These public health people are very looking at it through it. They didn't have Trump's insane hostility to the public health people, but that argument that Trump would make, that they're being very, overly focused just on one thing, and they don't understand how important economic well-being is. People were open to that. So the swing voters were much less interested in Biden's message on the pandemic. We even had some evidence that when Biden said, I'm going to trust the scientists, voters thought, I don't know about that. You know, they're good scientists, but do they really understand how the whole economy and everything? And I want a little more of a balanced approach. Now, Trump went so over the top in the way he dealt with the COVID thing and, you know, the recklessness of the rallies and the hostility to masks that he probably ended up on net hurting himself a little. But this is where the Biden campaign, they understood this. This is what their own focus group showed. They wanted to hear about Biden on the economy. They wanted to hear that Biden wanted to open things up safely. Right. And obviously, I believe it's a true argument to say that you can't really open up until you get the virus under control. But I would say Biden probably, and liberals much more generally, from a political point of view, spent too much time explaining that we've got to get the virus under control and not enough time explaining, and that will allow us to get you back to your jobs. And then Pelosi not coming through with the stimulus, I think, was a bit of a political mistake. So anyway, a long way of saying that the pandemic had more of a mixed political effect than people expected, you know.
Thanks very much. Alison, would you like to ask the next question?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, my camera has decided that it's done for the night. But we have a question from retired Ambassador David Litt, who's currently at the Institute for Defense and Business in Chapel Hill. He wants to know what both speakers think of Senator Mitch McConnell's style of leadership of the Republican Party in the Senate, whether it be in the majority or minority going forward, and what does this portend for government functioning in the Biden era?
Well, maybe I'll say a word about that first. And I mentioned that also. Look, I don't like it. I mean, it's not to my mind, the way the Senate's supposed to work. But to be fair to Mitch McConnell, the reason he gets away with this leadership is that 52 of his colleagues let him, you know? I mean, they don't work for Mitch McConnell. If they don't like it, they can depose him or just tell him, I'm not deposing you, but I'm opposing you on this bill. I'm not going to vote for cloture, or we need to bring stuff to the floor and have an open amendment process. I mean, I think it's very bad for American democracy that we don't have a normal legislative process where bills get passed by one body, come to the floor and go through committee and come to the floor in the other body, get amendments get voted up or down. Maybe we end up without legislation because neither one of the two houses doesn't want it. Maybe we get irreconcilable versions of the bills and they can't be reconciled to conference committees. But I mean, one doesn't want to glorify or romanticize the past. There was a lot of, you know, horse trading that was semi-corrupt and a lot of bad legislation got passed, I suppose, and interest groups got stroked and so forth. But you do want to have a system that sort of works that way. And it is now literally insane. I mean, that nothing comes to the floor. McConnell just personally decides not to bring anything to the floor. But that's not McConnell's fault. I mean, it's McConnell's fault in some way. But it's really the fault of his colleagues. And I don't even fully understand why. I mean, why run for the Senate if you're just going to be Mitch McConnell's, clerk? I mean, it's really kind of pathetic. And these are grown men and women who have some accomplishment in their life. You would think they wouldn't put up with it, but they do.
Why couldn't they agree on a stimulus bill? I mean, clearly there is a need in the country 2 months ago and still now, of course, to actually get a stimulus bill to the people, into the country. And both parties must see that. So why couldn't they achieve, even on this really crucial question, why couldn't they even achieve some sort of compromise on that?
Well, they will achieve a compromise, but they didn't do so before the election. I agree with Bill. I thought that was mishandled. I thought that they should have compromised. I thought that Pelosi could have taken the whatever it was, the problem solvers caucus thing. And the worst thing that would have happened would have been that McConnell would have not agreed to it. So it would have been seen as the Republicans' fault. I think that the way that was conducted hurt the Democrats in the congressional races. But, you know, again, if you look at the history, I mean, I might be wrong about this, but when the Democrats were out of power, or in those times when they controlled both houses or one house and there was a Republican president, you didn't find this same kind of polarization. I mean, you go back to Tip O'Neill and Reagan if you want. Or you go back to George W. Bush and the prescription drugs or whatever. This really is something very new and very, you know, almost insurrectionary, the way that the McConnell has used this and the way the Republicans have used this. And I would have been for just getting rid of the filibuster if if Democrats had won the majority, because the way that they have conducted themselves is really irresponsible. It's made it impossible to have constructive legislation. And, again, I'd go back to the way the whole Obamacare thing was handled. A very flawed bill, but it didn't have to be that flawed.
Okay, thank you very much. Brittany, we have plenty of questions here.
Yes, we do. My next question is from, oh, hold on. It just went all the way up. 1 second. As an international student, I would like to know just how American do you think is Donald Trump as a phenomenon? From Till.
Do you want? I'll answer that if you want.
Okay.
He's very, very American. I mean, I know people like that. I mean, remember with the Hollywood, the Access tape, where he's talking about pussies and stuff that, and he said, what did he say? It was locker room talk. It is, guys talk that way, think that way about women, and I mean, again, a lot of the problem with Trump is that he didn't make the transition from the way he behaved in the campaign, which was the way he behaved in the real estate industry, to being a president. He didn't understand that being a president is different, and you have to speak on behalf of all the people. So, yeah, I think he was. I think he is a very American phenomenon. It's just that being president is different, and you have to understand that, and he never understood that.
Thank you.
I would say, by contrast, though, that his form of conservatism, I think, is more European in certain ways. I mean, it's very idiosyncratic, of course, and I guess it's American. Literally, America First was American, but America First was actually repudiated by America and so both parties, and for 70 plus years. It's really unbelievable when you think about it, that he was able to bring back what was a discredited and I think pretty discreditable movement. Take the name of it. It wasn't like he did it in secret, right? America First. Everyone, I remember this in 2015. Everyone was like, do you know even what that was? And have you looked at the history of America First in 1941? And of course he didn't really know, but he vaguely knew because his father was part of it, I suppose. And it was, someone told him it was kind of anti-getting involved in foreign wars and so forth. But so it is kind of a version of Pat Buchanan's conservatism with some of the ideological stuff sanded off and a much more businessman, populist, New York kind of real estate deal maker stuff added. But I don't think it's an accident that he was so sympathetic to authoritarians abroad, and that he sort of saw that Orban and people like that were more like him in some ways than Merkel was like him. Now, you can argue, I have friends, people who used to work with me at the Weekly Standard. I don't agree with them at all anymore, but Chris Caldwell and other intelligent people who were sort of, that's the way it should, it's the way it had to be almost, that the kind of globalist, internationalist, Angela Merkel type of centrism. I mean, she's a conservative, sort of. I mean, she's from the Conservative Party in Germany. That's unsustainable. Pro-immigration, pro-trade. I think it's better for the world. I mean, honestly, and I think it's better for the countries that those people lead. But Trump didn't think so, and a lot more, as John sort of said, a lot more Americans didn't think so than people like me thought.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah, so our next question is from Rosemary Ford. She's in Chapel Hill and a grandmother of a current UNC student. She's wondering about, so immigration was a very important topic over the past 4 years, but at the same time, both campaigns seem to have shied away from it over the course of the campaign. And so she's wondering, moving forward, if President-elect Biden should pursue a more moderate immigration policy, or to what extent you think he feasibly can address the immigration issues that have been brought up more recently.
John, do you want to go?
Sure. I mean, he can do the DACA right away. I think he can reinstate that program so that kids who were brought here by parents who entered the country illegally would be able to go to school, get green cards, and eventually have a path to citizenship. I think that he can do that right away. I mean, Obama, George W. Bush tried to have a comprehensive immigration reform. If Biden wants to really, I was going to say waste his time, but if he wants to get into something really thorny, he could try that. But I think at this point, he's going to have other priorities, and he's not going to be able to address that. It's just too difficult. There's too many competing interests to get the kind of comprehensive reform where on the one hand, you have border security. On the other hand, you have a path to citizenship for the, 11 or 12 million people who are undocumented. I mean, it's a good program, but we just haven't been able to get it through the House and the Senate for 20 years.
On the other hand, the system is broken, and I don't know. It's be hard for Biden not to try, I think, as president, just because Bush and Obama tried, not because they loved the issue necessarily, because they just thought, it really has to be addressed. And I mean, I underestimated that issue. I shouldn't have, because in 2006, which I think is the original Bush-McCain bipartisan bill that then collapses, and then there's another one in 07, as I recall. So I think it was by late 06. Weekly Standard, the magazine I edited, we used to do these cruises, which a lot of magazines do, to universities do too. UNC probably has them, which in our case, for our subscribers or for others, in universities' case, usually for alumni, they make some money off them, cultural stuff, you have speakers, and it's nice, and so forth. And it was a way of reducing our deficit. And I remember that one. I mean, I wasn't an issue I really was totally involved in that much, but both Fred Barnes, my colleague, and I were friendly to the Bush-McCain immigration bill, and thought it was a reasonable thing without being, expert on the details. And I mean, our readers this was the Weekly Standard. It was not Newsmax or even Fox News. I mean, these were pretty well-educated people who were paying to come on a pretty nice cruise, who subscribed to the Weekly Standard, which is a fairly, upscale journal and so forth. And they were just so hostile. And I remember getting in pretty heated arguments and sort of saying, well, is it really that bad? And some of them were like, some of it was legitimate. It's a different experience if you're living in Southern Arizona, probably, than if you're living in Northern Virginia, where our experience with immigration is pretty much of a plus in most ways. Low unemployment, a lot of people working hard, a lot of kids going to school and doing well. It doesn't seem like a huge problem. Some legality questions, of course, but I mean, the degree of hostility, a lot of people were hostile. And they didn't live anywhere near any immigrants, incidentally. They were perfectly, upper middle class physicians and business people in the suburbs of Wichita or St. Louis or Phoenix or something. Well, Phoenix wouldn't be a good example, but, other places. They were, they weren't like swamped. Their wages were not being hurt. Whatever the labor argument against open borders was, this was not their concern. They weren't like thinking about working class people competing for jobs. But they were worked up on it. And somehow the loss of control, the cultural shifts, I mean, there was a lot going on in the immigration, terrorism then, of course, there's a lot going on in the immigration issue, which Trump exploited pretty demagogically, obviously. And so I don't know, it'd be interesting. It's a good question. Biden, I think it's hard for him just to say, I'm not doing anything. But the moment he touches it, it does have that sort of incendiary possibility that
there's an increase of border crossings in the next few months, early in the year. What is Biden going to do?
Yeah, I don't know.
He's not going to publicize it. I'll tell you that. I mean, again, what
Fox News will be.
Yeah, but look, the way I think you have to think about it is that he's going to have a chance only to do a few big things. And, one of them obviously has to be around the immediate stimulus and the health, the vaccine and all that stuff. That's going to be, trillions of dollars. Infrastructure, number two, that will include something that addresses climate change. And then he's going to have to repair Obamacare. And that's, I don't see anything beyond that. Those are going to be three big battles. I'm not setting his priorities. I think that's what he's going to have. I think that is necessarily going to be what he's going to have to address. And he's not going to be able to get to something like that.
Thank you. We'll pass it on to him.
Klaus says, if there's some caravan and Fox News goes berserk, or God forbid a terrorist incident, one forgets how much Trump, how lucky, I mean, it's terrible to say it this way as people died, but how lucky Trump was in 2015. I mean, you had the huge European migration crisis from Syria, which then was featured. People don't appreciate how much Fox was sort of going, Fox made it seem as if, you know, what was happening in Greece and in Germany then, which was incidentally wildly exaggerated in terms of how terrible it was, but whatever, was going to happen in the US, you know, the next day. And the combination of that and the more traditional concerns about cross-border immigration from Mexico, and then there were the terrorist attacks, obviously in Paris, especially, and then in Nice, which, you know, correctly got huge.
You mean in 2016 there was San
in
Bernardino and
Orlando? Trump
in
got
our
so
country.
lucky in terms of immigration. What's that?
Yeah. In our country, there was San Bernardino.
And San Bernardino,
Orlando.
that was the moment. San Bernardino was the moment. I'll tell a 30-second story about that. San Bernardino happened, I think it was November of 2015. Trump said the next day, Muslim ban. Everyone respectable said, you can't say that. You can say we need to be tougher on certain countries and look at the, you know, history of people. And it was irrelevant to the San Bernardino event anyway, incidentally, but, you know, but you can't like actually discriminate on the grounds of people's religion. We're going to say religious inquisition for people coming who applying for immigration status here. And Trump stuck with it. And I talked later with someone who had been working on another Republican campaign. So that was the moment Trump took over the front runner status for it was kind of a mixed deal. Remember, Ben Carson was there and Rubio. It was a little complicated who was going to win. And that was so, I mean, the degree to which, unfortunately, that the combination of terrorism and immigration were key to Trump's success. And 2015 was a bad year globally, pretty bad year for terrorism and a very bad year for migration.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Brittany, the next question, please.
So the next question is from an anonymous attendee. Following Nazism in World War II, the new German government mounted a sustained public relations campaign over 2 decades that promoted democracy and heavily criticized authoritarianism. Is such an effort needed now in the aftermath of Trumpism?
I mean, I'm friendly to those kinds of campaigns, and I think it worked pretty well. And all things considered, for most of the Cold War, and worked pretty well, incidentally, in the 90s. And people can dislike the Middle East interventions or the Iraq interventions, or the only one in the 2000s. But I still would defend the accession to the EU and to NATO of the Central and East European countries and so forth, and the insistence on democratic norms. I see that Hungary and Poland have now vetoed I guess it was an economic package, right? Because it had an insistence on certain liberal democratic norms in it. So I'm sort of an old-fashioned defender of that kind of democracy promotion or defense, but I don't know how much stomach there is for it in either party at this point, honestly.
What do you think, John?
Well, I think you have to make a distinction between promoting it and trying to impose it. And I mean, that's the problem that we got into in the United States, whether in Vietnam, Iraq, wherever. And, China is a big problem in the world. What they're doing with the Uyghurs, they have a kind of cyber totalitarianism. And I worry about the independence of Taiwan. But I don't know what we can do about it. I mean, that's the Europeans are going to have to take care of Orban and Poland. That's not, we're not going to send some ambassador over there who's going to say that Orban's the greatest thing since white bread, which Trump did do. But it's their problem. I mean, we're not going to be able to do anything about that. But the big problem is going to be China. And again, whether we reassert our human rights policy there, which I think we should do, but how far we can go, what are the limits?
Mm-hmm. Maybe we should go and have another question.
Whoa.
Alison?
Yes, so our next question is from Joseph Holmes, a current student of Professor Larres. His question is for both panelists. He says that given that both 2020 candidates campaigned in part on ending quote unquote forever wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, shouldn't it be a priority of the incoming Biden administration to adopt a much more restrained foreign policy, eschewing foreign military interventions and winding down US troop numbers in active war zones?
Well, I really loathe the forever wars formulation. It was a very clever one, whoever came up with it. It's, I mean, in my view, totally ridiculous. We're not in a forever war in Iraq and Syria. We're in a kind of peacekeeping stability mission, which is, thank God, has very rather limited casualties, and I think is worth what we're doing. And of course, Syria, you know, that kind of had, we didn't intervene there, and that sort of worked out quite badly for the Syrian people, tragically, and incidentally destabilized Europe much more, destabilized the region and Europe much more than the Iraq War, which was allegedly so destabilizing. So we don't need to litigate all these fights from the last 20 years, I suppose. But I very much agree that after 8 years of Barack Obama, after Bush's mismanagement of Iraq, and then managing to push through the surge kind of amazingly, but that was kind of the exhaustion of the Bush presidency. And then Obama saying, you know, nation building begins at home, and Trump saying in a much more vulgar and dramatic way, he doesn't care about the rest of the world. Nation building really does begin at home, begins and ends at home, maybe you might say would be Trump's view, America first. 12 years of that, there's not much support now for, I think people don't understand actually how important, you know, if, not necessarily the willingness to use force, but a kind of forward deployment of troops and a willingness to support our allies and so forth is pretty easy, honestly, and we don't pay that much for it, and we get a lot of good out of it. But I worry there. I mean, I think Trump's putting Biden in a very difficult position with this drawdown in Afghanistan and Iraq, where it's almost to such a low number, it's going to be hard to sustain. It's sort of force protection is all they can be able to do. And someone's going to say at some point, what are we doing there? We can't really do counterterrorism, so let's just get out. Or we have to send a few more thousand troops back, which is going to be very hard politically for Biden. So I'm worried about the forever war rhetoric having continued effect. I think it's already had deleterious effect, but it has a lot of support. It always has, obviously, in America, who wants to, you know, everyone doesn't like, I mean, people don't like fighting wars, certainly. I don't know if they really don't like having troops deployed in reasonably abroad. I mean, if they're not in the midst of a real war. But they're nervous about it, understandably, and it's so yeah. I think it'll be tough for Biden to sustain that.
Thank you, Brittany. Do you want to take another question? There's a question about Russia. Do you see that right at the top? Maybe it takes this one.
My God,
I'm not seeing the Russia question.
Yeah, but
Diane, I do. Yeah. This question is from Diane Kirby in Belfast, from the Trinity College of Dublin. She asks, Hillary Clinton and the Democrats sought to delegitimize Trump's presidency by alleging Russian intervention in the 2016 election. Is Trump's allegation that the 2020 election stolen from him not a reflection of the same delegitimization process? And does that not tell us something about the direction of the American political system?
Well, I'll answer that. I mean, I think that the Democrats and the Clinton people went too far in the early part or first year of the Trump administration to make this case that that in some sense his election was stolen. The problem was that Trump was not a politician. I mean, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush had to put up with a lot of this stuff during his first year because of Bush v. Gore and Florida. But, you know, he dealt with it. He didn't go crazy. He didn't start with the tweets. Trump's reaction again to these kinds of charges was, I think really that's what set him off on having a presidency that was very much an extension of his 2016 campaign. So again, I'm not disagreeing with the comparison. I think I would hear people talk about Trump's impeachment before he was even inaugurated. I'm not talking about Democratic politicians, but more in the intelligentsia. But again, you have to deal with it. And what Trump's doing now goes way beyond what any of the Democrats did after the election in 2016. He's trying to screw up the transition between himself and Biden. And if you remember, Obama was very cooperative with Trump. So he's going way beyond that. It's one thing to complain that the thing was stolen and the other thing to try to actually subvert the results.
Thank you. Bill, so do you think the Russians propelled Trump into the White House in 2016?
Oh, let's
try to help.
That one. I don't know.
Well, I have to ask a little provocative.
Well, empirically, we know that WikiLeaks dumped, those emails the day of the tape, and they probably had some effect. And I don't believe that was unconnected to Russian intelligence. That's what the U.S. intelligence community judged, and I think that's a fair judgment. Doesn't mean he wouldn't have won without Russian help. Doesn't mean the help was very effective. He certainly has been very reluctant to ever criticize Putin about anything. And so I don't think he's a Russian agent or anything like that, but it was legitimate to have concerns. And then he did get impeached for actually trying to do something in Ukraine that was totally inappropriate. So I'm not sympathetic to the argument that because Trump felt aggrieved, he gets to really subvert the confidence in the American electoral system in an election where he could. He sort of said this once, but he's sort of forgotten this argument that, he actually could take some credit. The government did a pretty good job, it looks like, of beating back foreign interference to the degree it was intended. But now he's just lying about the results and about how the election works and how the voting works and how the machines work. And now we're in real conspiracy theory kookiness. Trump was impeached for things he did in Ukraine. Tried to do that was stopped ultimately by kind of the career foreign service types and by others and by the intelligence community and by whistleblower. Not a single thing that anyone testified to was challenged as a factual matter. Fiona Hill or Marie Yovanovitch or, all of them, John Bolton for that matter, in his book. No one's really challenged any of the factual statements about how Trump ran foreign policy as kind of an adjunct to his personal, interests in discrediting Biden. He was right to see that Biden was the most dangerous candidate, I guess, against him, and tried to get some foreign help to discredit him. So on the one, so I have no sympathy for Trump's, complaint, which is not at all embracing, and also the kookiness of the conspiracy theories he's embraced. The machines and this, real craziness, which has gotten really pervasive. The conspiratorialists, I say we haven't done justice to this, and John's been a little too nice to Trump, I think, in this respect, maybe, and I have too. Hard to believe, but it's one thing to be populist, right-wing, demagogic, divisive. Bringing the conspiracy theorizing into the mainstream is very dangerous, because it's sort of not falsifiable. If someone says something, the following, makes some claims, and then if you say, wait a second, here's the actual facts, or here's how the economy is doing contrary to what you said, or here's something true about the world. Once you get into the kind of fever swamps of conspiracy theories, it's very hard to prove them false, because they're sort of self-reinforcing. Everything that disproves the theory is just proof that the conspiracy is even deeper than you thought, And so that's very damaging. It's very damaging to a democracy. It's very damaging to politics, where you'd like to have some agreement on facts and some commitment to truth, even though that's never perfect in politics. And I think Trump has been and the Republicans generally, the tolerance of that has been really irresponsible in a way that goes way beyond the typical tolerance for a certain amount of exaggeration and demagoguery on your own side.
Thank you. Will Trump have to face a lot of court cases once he has left office, and maybe see an ex-president ending up in jail, perhaps? Is that a likely prospect? How would you see that?
It could happen.
It's Southern District of New York.
Yeah, So that would be state and federal level. I don't think Biden has much interest in that. Yeah. But if the Justice Department finds certain things, I suppose, they have to.
Or really pardon himself.
I think he'll try to pardon a lot of people, and probably try to pardon himself, and then let that be litigated if they try to indict him. But he can't pardon himself for the state and local crimes. So he's got some problems there. I'm sort of ambivalent about that. On the one, you hate to see someone get away with violating a whole bunch of laws. On the other hand, probably not good for the country, honestly, to have that kind of, prosecution. And generally speaking, most countries have avoided that kind of thing. Most healthy democracies try to avoid that, even if there is evidence of corruption and so forth. So
Biden will do
a tough thing for Biden. If he has to face the question of some pardons and so forth.
So Biden may pardon him for the sake of the country? like German.
I don't think Biden can pardon him for state,
No,
offenses. So
yeah.
There is a
All right.
question in the Q&A that bounces off of this from retired Foreign Service Officer Mike Bennett in Cary. He asks, assuming that President Trump does pardon himself but gets convicted in New York State of criminal behavior and goes to prison, please comment on how that affects the Republican Party and potential candidates in the future.
And I would say this, to the degree that Trump gets embroiled in court cases, to the degree that these reveal unappealing things, let's say about Trump's, business practices, the Trump family, the use of federal government policies to enrich himself and so forth, which God knows that could be a lot of, that probably does inevitably just reduce his clout. So maybe, it's a good correction maybe to what I was saying earlier, where if you imagine Trump, in pleasant retirement and semi-retirement in Mar-a-Lago, having rallies and dominating either Fox TV or some other TV station, that's one image. An image of him with lawyers having to appear in court and fight back all these cases, that's a very different situation. So it could hurt him, even if ultimately, he may not get convicted, or he might not serve time, or governors, I guess, pardon state crimes, right? So they could pardon him if they wished and so forth. So he will try very hard, I believe, before he goes out the door, though, to pardon everyone. So there's no one who has an incentive to testify against him. I wouldn't put it beyond him to destroy papers and do an awful lot of things that would make it harder for him to be prosecuted.
I'll just say one thing about this. We were discussing this privately a few days ago, that you have to remember how old Trump is. He's 74 now. He would be 78 in 2024. Presidency is the most difficult job you could imagine. It's going to take a lot out of him. You can see the effects during the last year. He's completely lost his sense of humor. He's extraordinarily brittle. I would expect him to fall through a trap door sometime in the next year. I don't think that he's going to be a major figure in American politics for very long. And if you add to that the court case, getting embroiled in court cases, I'm really, after Biden is inaugurated, I think you could stop worrying about Trump. I hope I'm not wrong about that, but that's what I think.
Thanks very much. Okay. Alison, do we have another question?
Yeah. So Oliver Stelling, a senior communications advisor in Dubai, has a question for both panelists. He says the GOP is now Trump's party. How can Biden, who promised to be a president for all Americans, unite the country without weakening core democratic values? And a corollary question from David is, what can be done to reduce polarization among Americans?
What was the first part of it? What just do the first part once more.
So the first part is, how can Biden, who promised to be a president for all Americans, unite the country without weakening core democratic values?
Well, I don't know whether that's small d or big D, but what struck me as somebody who's written about nationalism. I wrote a book, that was my previous book, was the Nationalist Revival, was that the election was really about two different versions of nationalism. Trump's was an exclusionary nationalism, the nationalism of America first. This is the guy who, and this was the moment when I knew we were in trouble. Before he was inaugurated, when he said, the reason I lost the election to Hillary Clinton in the popular vote was 5 million illegal immigrants voted. Again, you knew right then that we were dealing with somebody who was going to divide the country, and that his version of America first was that only certain people here were Americans. Biden had a very Lincolnian approach to nationalism. We are the United States of America. No, there are no red states. There's no blue states. We're all together. Now, how he's going to do that, I don't know, but that's the right sentiment. I mean, that's what got Obama famous in 2004. And it comes out of Abraham Lincoln and his version of American nationalism. So you know, again, rhetorically, we're on the right track with what Biden said. How he's going to do it is another problem.
Bill, you want to come in on that?
Well, just the obvious. I mean, so I think there are ways to do it. So we did our Republican voters against
Yeah.
Trump. And we tested a lot of stuff, and I may have mentioned this, but it was much more effective to have people on camera on their cell phones again saying, look, I voted for Trump in 2016, or I considered doing so, or I stayed home because I couldn't stand Hillary Clinton. And, you know, I wanted change. I wanted a businessman, and I'm sympathetic to some of what he did. I'm happy with the court appointments, let's just say. But it's too much. I can't do another 4 years. It's too divisive. It's too dangerous. That was much more effective than, you know, saying what I would say, you know, it's been terrible since 2015. It's a disgrace. It's, you know, so there's a way in which Biden's rhetoric is a little closer to those Republican voters against Trump, you might say. He doesn't blame people for voting for Trump. He doesn't think it's a moral deficiency on their part. He doesn't. So I think he has some chance to get some of those voters over, give them a chance. Now, it does take two to tango, though. And what is the Republican Party going to be like? I mean, that would be for me, that's a very big, if Biden were left alone, you know, I think he'd be pretty effective kind of at getting an awful lot of working class, middle class voters to say, okay, you know what, maybe that Trump thing was a little overboard and whatever, but now we got to give Biden a chance. But if the Republicans are attacking him from day one, or in this case, before day one, in Trump's case, whipping everyone up, finding every occasion, as John was saying in 2016, that Trump did to us 2017, of, you know, attacking any group that's part of the Democratic Party, getting racial issues front and center again. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. All this election return isn't explicit. Election contesting isn't explicitly usually racial, but it's all about stopping, not counting the votes in Detroit and Milwaukee and
Atlanta.
So, you know, I worry that Biden could have all the goodwill in the world, as Lincoln did, incidentally, but it didn't do any good because, you know what, the South wanted to defend slavery and they didn't want the expansion of slavery limited, and Lincoln gave a wonderful first inaugural, and the war happened. I don't think that we're not in that situation, obviously, but there's a little bit of a problem of, it is, as I think the previous questioner maybe said, it is Trump's party now, the Republican Party, to some degree, or to a considerable degree. If it stays Trump's party, it's going to be very hard for Biden to do that much, I'm afraid, in the national unity way.
But according to John Judis, Trump will be deflated and go
That would
away.
be good. That would be good from John's lips.
And we would all be delighted. Let's hope you're right. Brittany, please, the next question.
Of course, this is in the similar line of thought from Stuart Kaplan. Can one view the record turnout of over 150 million votes in the 2020 election as a disturbing sign of divisiveness in the US? And would a smaller turnout conversely have shown a more united nation? How does the turnout affect this divisive state that we're in?
Well, the turnout was probably a factor of two things. One is Trump himself, and the second is the pandemic that gave us something to do and think about and to freak out about. And no, I think those were the two factors that really contributed to the high turnout.
I mean, I would say, yeah, so there was mobilization on both sides, and there's quite a lot of evidence that there was the turnout kind of canceled each other out, in the sense that there was a lot of turnout in Trump country, there was a lot of turnout in Biden country. Biden ended up 4% ahead of Trump, a little over 4 probably at the very end. Hillary was a little over 2% ahead of Trump, so Biden just was able to tweak 2% of the voters, well, 1% if you think about it, right? 1% times 2, over to him from Trump, from Trump in 2016, and they both mobilized their voters pretty well. I mean, it is a problem ultimately that our elections now are so much about mobilization and so little about persuasion. I mean, just from a point of view of like democratic, I mean, they've always been, of course, to a considerable degree in every democracy. No one thought that we were having, Oxford debates in Britain, let alone here, and let alone anywhere else, that people were judging based on the points that people were scoring in terms of arguments. That's not even true. How people don't even judge Oxford debates that way. They probably mostly vote for the people they agree with, right? But the degree to which it's become more mobilization and less persuasion. You can just see that in the decline of split ticket voting, in the fact that everything now follows through the presidential. I mean, the Senate races, if you were in a state that Trump won and you were a Republican senator, you were in almost, I think, in maybe literally every case, but in almost every case, you were fine. And if you were in a state that Trump lost and you were a Republican candidate, you lost. And in North Carolina, it was very exciting. Cal Cunningham, maybe he was going to win. And you know what? Trump won the state by 1.5, and Cunningham lost by what, 2.5 or something. I mean, it's pretty close. Collins is the one senator who won against her party. And she had such a well-established brand in Maine. I think Ron Brownstein has these numbers. I'm going to get them slightly wrong, but I think in the 20 states that have gone twice in a row for Trump, there are now, of the 40 senators from those 20 states, 39 are Republican. Maybe I have it backwards, maybe that's Democratic. In the 25 states that have gone for Trump, I think maybe twice in a row, 47, that's it. In the 20 states that have gone twice for Clinton and then Biden, 39 of those 40 senators are Democrats. In the 25 states, I think it is, that have gone twice, since you get smaller states usually, twice in a row for Trump, 47 of those 50 senators are Republican. There's like, Sherrod Brown in Ohio and a couple of other Democrats who are hanging on in Trump states. So we have the polarization is up and down, and the turnout just, increased the numbers. It is World War I, right? It's sort of like you can have a trench warfare with 20,000 soldiers on either side. You can have trench warfare with 25,000 soldiers on either side. It matters, but you don't want to be at 20,000 and the other side's at 25,000. So politically, it's important to turn out your voters. But if both sides do the turnout effectively, you're still in trench warfare.
Thank you. I just see an interesting question from Princeton, from Phil Kirsten from Princeton. He asked, why did Trump do better with African-American voters and with Hispanic voters than he did 4 years ago? That is indeed puzzling, isn't it?
I mean, John, to that, go ahead.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little. With Hispanic voters, one of the things one of the ways you start off with that is that the category itself is suspect. There's just so many different nationalities involved and so many different regions of the country involved. Florida, there's a very clear reason that Trump did better among people who would come from Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, and their children. Again, you have to think about what he did with the Cuba, going very close to just breaking relations, Venezuela, trying to overthrow Maduro. So that's the reason he gets that big vote there. South Texas, I recommend an article in Politico that just came out. Somebody went down there. And I had this experience. People would tell me when I did stories in Texas about the elections there, and remember the governor's race there with Wendy Davis against Abbott, and she was a big abortion proponent. The people on the border there, very socially conservative, and Bill mentioned this. Very worried about keeping business open. Worried about the oil and gas industry. So again, more congenial in that sense to Trump than to Biden. Worried about the Democrats. Last thing, you could do that, but the last thing about the Hispanic vote is that I've looked at this over the years, and it's not like blacks and Jews are Democrats. And it almost doesn't matter how much money you make, how much education you have. With Hispanics, it does matter. And small business versus working class makes a difference. And so you get, as people go up the ladder, they become more worried about taxes and spending and things like that, and they become more likely to be Republicans. So, put those factors together, and that's why in this election, Trump did somewhat better with Hispanics. Blacks, it was males. It was not that it was black males. A friend of mine, I'm not allowed to say this, but he could say it for me because he's a former Black Panther, and said the macho factor was really important with Trump. He's a tough guy. He was, again, I don't know the answer to it. It may be that among black male voters, you are beginning to see the same thing. The better off they are, the more the sympathetic they are to Republicans, because there really is, believe it or not, a black middle class and a black upper middle class. So again, that might have been the Sorry to go on that long, but that might have
Bill,
been
do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just, I mean, just empirically, the gender gap among African Americans was great. I mean, it seems like, at least in the exit polls, which could be wrong in the absolute numbers, but they're probably right directionally, 18% of African American men for Trump, 8% of African American women, much bigger than the gender gap proportionally, if you think about it, among white voters. Yeah, Latinos, I do think, it's going to take some time for people to process this. They are probably, it's better to think of them as a recent immigrant group who have had a distinctive voting pattern, but it's gradually eroding and becoming more of a class voting, regional voting, interest voting, and so forth. So think of Italians or something like that. And incidentally, I mean, just to be, again, very empirical, their intermarriage rates are high enough also that it's not even clear who you're talking about in some of these areas. I mean, it's not like, they just, so, it is, again, think of Italian, in the 1930s, people wrote articles and books and studying Italian voting patterns in 1945 in New York City and New Jersey. And every ticket in New York had to have an Italian on it, in New York City, in the mayoral or city council, or what was the third position, controller or something like that, races. I remember this from being a kid, every ticket was balanced often, you'd have the Italian, the Irish, maybe the Jew, or the old fashioned WASP. And it was a big deal, Italian politician. Now that seems like a different world. I mean, a little bit of that residually, but it's like, come on, And I think Latinos are moving more in that direction, which is probably good for America, incidentally. It shows that the assimilating kind of melting pot side of America remains much stronger than people think. But it does mean that as a distinctive voting bloc, they're getting a little more like their peers in terms of region and class.
Alison, thank you. Alison, do we have another question?
Yeah, so we have two related questions, one from PM Blatt and the other from Jacob Mathai. One is, can Trump bomb Iran in the next few weeks over the objection of the military? And the other is, how will Biden handle the Iranian situation after Trump certainly aggravates relations?
I mean, one problem we have, this is something that, again, should be addressed by Congress, and people have written in bipartisan stuff on this. I mean, it's one thing to have a president have the right to retaliate. I think that's probably necessary. You can't have Congress come in if you have a threat and there's a need for preemptive action. But the idea that you would just launch an attack, again, absent a, impending attack on Americans or something like that, on another country, because you don't like, I mean, believe me, I'm anti-Iran, but because you don't like the government, or you think the nuclear thing's getting out of control, that's really not the way it's supposed to work. I mean, whatever you think of the Iraq War, which was a war of choice, as they say, Bush got congressional authorization for the Iraq War, and he did for Afghanistan too, but there would have been more of a right of defense immediately. So, can he? I mean, it's all eroded so much, the congressional control, that he might be able to. I think there'd be huge resistance, though, in the military. And people would worry that it was actually an unlawful act unless there was a legitimate reason why something had to happen. Taking out a terrorist leader who's got American blood on his hand and who arguably was planning other terrorist attacks, which is what they had to say to justify it with Soleimani, is one thing. But a real attack on the nuclear program. Now, cyber attack's a little different from a kinetic attack. Covert attack is different from an overt attack. There are a lot of things he could do that the military might go.
Do you expect something to happen like that?
I'm a Ron Hawk, but I'm worried about what they're doing over in the Defense Department. If you look at the pattern of appointments since the election, extremely unusual to replace, obviously, a cabinet secretary for the last 2.5 months. But everyone said, well, that's just Trump. He doesn't like this guy. Esper, didn't do everything Trump wanted him to do, which is true, and rebuked him after the Lafayette Square thing. But, he then replaced several other people below him, including, and put people in who were really, in my opinion, kind of crazy and not who you would want running the Defense Department of the United States. Now, the uniform military is very institutionalized, and other parts of the Pentagon are too. And they're not going to just snap to it and start doing crazy things because some 34-year-old person who was just put in as the acting deputy undersecretary for intelligence or for special operations says that he wants this done, or even because Chris Miller, the acting secretary of defense, says he wants it done. And I assume there would still be some of those institutional barriers. Well, I know there would be, but I'm a little worried about reckless things happening. Probably not quite the extreme scenario of, the bombers taking off, but other things happening that will put Biden in a position of having to make some tough, either inheriting a mess, or he's the one who's president when the retaliation comes, or having to make some tough decisions. In any case, that instead of Trump doing what a normal president would do, what we did in '92, which was to sort of back off and say, okay, you're going to be taking over. In most cases, we're going to try to stabilize things and let you go ahead with your policies. Obama had a pretty aggressive attack on parts of ISIS in late 2016. They kind of teed up, and they decided to not to do it. Wasn't hugely time sensitive. Didn't matter if it happened on December 30th or January 30th, So they held off and gave the plans to, obviously the plans don't go away, let the Trump administration inherit the plans, brief the Trump administration, the incoming administration on it, and let Trump do it. Because they didn't want to be in the position of starting something that Trump didn't want to complete and ending up in the worst of both worlds. I have no confidence that the Trump people have any such public spirited character. So I worry about what could happen.
Thank you. John, are you worried as well?
Oh, it's about on the level of being worried about whether they're going to, Republican legislatures will get the electors not to vote for the actual candidate who won in the electoral college. This is another kind of plot. I think there would be major resignations, including the national security advisor, before Trump would enter into a kind of major conflict in the last 2 months of his presidency.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, but we have still got a few questions here which people would like to see addressed. May I ask the panelists perhaps to go on for another 10, 12, 13 minutes before we call it quits? Or are you exhausted already?
10 minutes.
We'll give you a very quick question.
Okay.
I've got to go.
Okay, good questions. That's right. Brittany, some good questions, please.
Here could be possibly a quick question, depending on your conviction. It's from an anonymous attendee. It's for either panelist or both. What is the likelihood that Biden will expand the Supreme Court as Trump alleges?
I mean, he can't.
Zero.
The Republican Senate won't go along. So.
Yeah.
And the Democratic Senate wouldn't go along if it was 50-50. I think the only way it would happen in general, even if they won the Senate, is if very dramatic conservative assertiveness by the Supreme Court, e.g. overturning Roe or something like that, then I think you could imagine a real attempt to expand the size. But if it's just marginal stuff from the courts, I don't think there'd be enough support for it.
Thank you. Alison, do we have another question?
Yes, Ray wants to know what the panelists' thoughts are on Kamala Harris and her position now that she's VP.
On her position, well, we'll see what kinds of powers Biden gives her. I don't know. The question is whether she's going to inherit the nomination in 2024, whether he'll run. So we really don't know. It's a complete question mark.
Do you think it was or she was a good pick for him? That was a good choice for him.
I mean, personally, she was not my favorite. I felt I felt that the one area where she was most secure in terms of her understanding was the one area she wasn't willing to talk about, which was criminal justice and her experience as Attorney General and those kind of issues. She was much less sure of herself on, let's say, healthcare policy, where she kept changing and. Again, but we'll see. People grow up. I mean, she had only been in the Senate a few years. She's going to have a lot of experience as vice president. She's very smart. So we'll have to see.
Bill, how do you see that?
I worked for a vice president. I mean, vice presidents don't have that much power usually. And when their boss is someone who was a vice president, which was true in our case with Quayle, George H.W. Bush was president and is now with Vice President Biden becoming president. They don't feel like they went through the 4, or in Biden's case, 8 years of being vice president, which can be a pretty frustrating. I mean, it's a wonderful life and a great honor and so forth, but it can be pretty frustrating. And they didn't go through that to sort of let their vice president run things, So I actually think Biden will be a strong president and will delegate. I mean, I'm sure he'll be respectful of her, of course, but he doesn't. It's funny. Normally, so Quayle, if I could just go back 25 years, 30 years. he had been a senator. Bush had never been a senator, and the Bush administration actually had almost no one who had been a senator. So Quayle was actually useful. We did a lot of stuff. It was totally unpublicized, but we would talk to a lot of senators, including Democrats, whom Quayle had good personal relationships with, different era, and help out. A lot of little things. Someone's candidacy was in trouble, for something. Could you get to someone on the phone? I remember doing a lot of stuff for Quayle. The call would come back from a senator, and he was busy, so I'd take the call as chief of staff and talk for a bit, and I got to know a lot of these senators that way. But Biden was a senator. So, and Kamala Harris was a senator. So I don't think that he doesn't help her much with him which doesn't help him that much with that. So I actually think, given that he's likely to be a one-term president, I kind of think the focus with her will be towards 2024. But it's not like everyone else is just going to step aside either for her then. So I really don't know if she'll have particular responsibilities or really a particular role, or just be what a good vice president is often, which is
But do you think she was a good choice for him? Well,
I'm mixed. Good enough. Didn't do harm, which is probably the key, honestly, for these choices. She wasn't quite my first choice, but I wasn't against her either. Not that anyone asked, not that I had any say in his choice, but and I'm not sure. The other choices would have been complicated in other ways as well. And I think she did an adequate job. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Brittany, do we have another question?
We do. This question is from Laura Stillman in Raleigh. She asks, it sounds as though the GOP is perhaps in a better position right now than the Dems, in spite of winning the White House. What is the message and strategy the Dems should employ in order to build on Biden's win and not allow the GOP to maintain the position that they're speaking for the average American? It's very distressing to think they could win the House in 22 and the White House in 24. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sort of distressed about that too, but I think it's just empirically a possibility. I don't know. You got the Democratic coalition is in some ways trickier than the Republican coalition. John and I went back a little up forth on this about which party has them. Both parties have some dissension, but the degree to which upper middle class, coastal elite Democrats, and I don't say that pejoratively, just descriptively, a lot of them are my good friends, are just living in sort of different worlds from middle America, working class potential Democrats, is maybe greater. On the Republican side, you've got the sort of big finance people and then the white working class. They are empirically in different worlds, but they've managed to somehow convince each other, or certainly convince the voters, that they're kind of on the same page. So, and Trump was pretty good at actually, he was Mr. Wall Street, not Wall Street, Mr. New York, big, super rich guy, billionaire who had the interests of working class voters allegedly at heart. I think the Democratic coalition, the coalition of woke Democrats and upper middle class professionals, young woke Democrats, upper middle class professionals, and moderate Democrats of Virginia. You saw the controversy already with Abigail Spanberger, who's from near here in Virginia, and AOC and Pelosi. It's a complicated party to manage. And so there's no magic wand. I think the obvious thing, though, is they do need to just reduce Republican margins among white working class voters. And that means a little less of the woke stuff and a little more attention to the economic troubles of those voters. They shouldn't give away, in my opinion, on any of the fundamental issues on civil rights and on decency. They shouldn't pander to those voters less attractive, prejudices and so forth. But there are ways to speak to them that don't look probably quite as tone deaf and quite as condescending as some Democrats either have done, or, to be fair to the Democrats, are portrayed as having done. The Republicans have done a good job of creating a kind of cartoon version of the Democrats, but it is striking when you talk to the Democrats. Two Democratic congresswomen lost in South Florida, and they presumably know they won in 2018. They probably know their districts pretty well. They're intelligent people. And they said that to fund the police stuff and the socialism stuff really hurt. And I can sit here, and I'm a pretty conservative guy on economics and actually on law and order to some degree too. And I can tell you that it's ridiculous. Believe me, that Joe Biden is not a socialist. And John Judis knows that very well as someone who is a democratic socialist. And Joe Biden was the author of the 1994 crime bill that increased the size of police forces, and which he then sort of had to semi-apologize for. And he's not for defunding the police. He was, it's all ridiculous. But it did, the cartoon somehow worked, because there were some Democratic mayors and governors who didn't look like they cared that much about the destruction of property in some of the demonstrations after, that last summer. And because they, I don't know, they were nice to AOC and polite to her when she said Green New Deal, and then they just tack that right onto the Democrats. So the Republican message machine is pretty good at caricaturing the Democrats. But I don't think the Democrats are quite as good at explaining that they're not that caricature.
Thanks very much. Perhaps we have time for one final question.
You want me to say what I think the Democrats?
Oh, you want to come in? Yeah, sure, sure. I didn't want to cut you off, John, at all.
No, that's fine. And but I mean, I'm going to say the same thing in part that Bill said, which is economics, economics, economics. But economics, again, directed at all the different parts of the country. To two examples, Mark Warner runs for governor. I don't know when it was like 2000 or something like that. Goes to Southern Virginia, talks to rural voters, gets a very surprising result. Hillary Clinton, when she first ran for Senate, went to upstate New York, talked about economic development there. Again, Biden has to do big things on economics, but he has to, again, think in terms of infrastructure, industry, but rebuilding those parts of the country. Economic patriotism, again, that was he has a policy, thing that he got from Elizabeth Warren on that. There's certain things that America should make. What's he going to do about it? I mean, if we're going to block Huawei, are we going to make our own telecom equipment for 5G? Are we going to have universal broadband? Again, that's what I do. I would stay away from the social issues if possible. Again, issues of simple justice, absolutely, but nothing, again, that not as a focus. Social programs, healthcare, universal, not for a particular group, but programs that help everybody. So that would be my focus, and that would go back to the question about how to bring the country together. That I think that again is that's the pathway.
And I think that's just the way. I mean, Mark Warner, I think, was 2001, if I recall, in Virginia. Hillary Clinton was 2000, right. The upstate New York trip. I mean, this is just a question, really a question. Is the country the same country as it was 20 years ago, where white working class voters in upstate New York or Southwest Virginia are even open to hearing that anymore? Or have they been, for various reasons, so radicalized in kind of the cultural splits that it'd be very hard to make that pitch? And so, I mean, that's been the question of the last few election cycles. And I would say the Democrats haven't unlocked that lock yet.
Thanks very much. We have one final question. Alison, do you want to select one final question?
Yeah, so for our final question, I think we'll go with Brian Kaleff. He's asking broadly about projections over the next 4 years. Specifically, he wants to know to what extent Trump will retain his hold over the Republican Party, to what extent you think Biden has a good chance of being a successful president, considering COVID, the economy, racism, and climate change. And perhaps most interestingly, he wants to know, I'm assuming in the event that Biden doesn't run for re-election, what will be the jockeying for power within the Democratic Party for the nomination in 2024, and who will prevail?
And please keep in mind, we only have a few minutes left, so we could use another half an hour for that.
You want me to do it first? Because I'm about to conk out anyway. Look, Biden can ride a successful recovery to re-election or approbation or whatever. That's his opportunity. We are going to get a vaccine. We are going to get over this. And, again, if he can get a big stimulus program, we'll have an economic recovery and he'll get credit for it. So that's his, I've already talked about, I don't think Trump is going to play a big role, but there is going to be a Trumpism without Trump. Again, big government republicanism, I think I would call it, and attention to trade, U.S.-China rivalry, those kind of issues, Cotton, Hawley, Rubio, those people. 2024, really, I can't predict, though, because we don't know. Biden, again, you don't know about these health issues. He might run again. Kamala Harris might, we'll leave that to I'll leave that to the geniuses to figure out.
The only thing I'd say on that is, I think the lesson of the last 10, 20 years is that in the modern media environment in particular, people can merge very quickly. Barack Obama elected to the Senate
Right.
before President of the United States in 2008. Trump, kind of oddball, slightly crackpot New York businessman, birther, lunacy, president, nominee and president 4 years later. Kamala Harris comes to the Senate in 2014, 16, I guess, right? And
Hi, baby, come here.
And vice president now. So people who had just gotten elected could be nominees, or people who've been in 2 years. So we tend to think of, even the names we've been tossing out. Cotton elected to the Senate in 14, Hawley, I think 16 maybe. So again,
Right.
not there for very long. So, and there could be people even more recent, and governors making their names and so forth. So I think it's a very fluid situation. And in the modern media environment, you get the right issue, the right person, the right time, suddenly dramatic, Ron DeSantis does X in Florida, or someone else does Y in someplace else, or some Democratic governor does something really successful in terms of bringing jobs back to working class areas. And, you can just, it's very hard to, it's a more fluid situation. My biggest mistake I've always made in politics is this kind of prognostication, is looking at, things in a static way, a snapshot, and not realizing that 3 or 4 years is a lifetime of politics.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we have to come to an end because John Judis's cat wants to have some attention.
He's been pestering me the whole time.
We couldn't possibly keep you from the cat. I would like to thank John Judis and Bill Kristol for an excellent discussion, for enlightening us in a very profound and deep way. We certainly have learned an awful lot about American politics, both in the past and going forward towards a successful Biden administration. I get the impression from the two of you that you're both fairly optimistic that Biden will perhaps not be a brilliant president, but a successful president. Tell me in a few concluding words what you think the next few years will bring. Bill, do you want to say?
Your lips to God's ear, I mean, the country, leaving aside partisanship, the country could use a successful presidency, and it would be really, I worry if he fails, both parties could be radicalized in ways that would really be damaging to the country, I think.
Thank you. Would you agree with that, Tim?
I worry a lot about stalemate and gridlock between the Republicans and Democrats, White House and Senate. And, I hope that Biden can get beyond that. And so it's more it's not I'm not making a prophecy. I'm just telling you what I hope.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, Bill Kristol, John Judis, was excellent. Thank you very much for dedicating your time and energy to us. And I would like to thank, of course, Brittany Broom and Alison Carpenter for being such capable assistants. And I would like to thank all the many viewers which are still here. The hardcore is still here after almost 2.5 hours, which is pretty impressive, I think. I would like to thank all of you for being such supporters and loyal followers to the Krasno Global Events Series this semester and in previous years. As I said at the beginning, we will be back in early February 2021 with the new semester, and hopefully we will have another exciting program for you. And until then, I wish you a happy Thanksgiving already, and see you in the near future. And please don't forget about us, and remember to watch our famous and popular YouTube channel where all our events will be seen. You can see in the future, you can see John Judis 3 times on there. And perhaps in the future, we can also welcome Bill Kristol back, and so he can be viewed a few times on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much again, Bill and John, and Brittany and Alison. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right.